In May 2000, researchers from universities and non-governmental organizations in 18 countries came together with women fish workers from Atlantic Canada to talk about some of the changes that are happening in fisheries around the world. They compared experiences, explored the links between local and global change, and talked about how these changes are affecting women and men in fisheries communities. They met in Newfoundland, on Canada's Atlantic coast. Newfoundland has been the site of one of the greatest ecological catastrophes in recent history, the collapse of the northern cod stocks.
We have come together here located in Newfoundland, and we have seen the faces of the people who have experienced one of the most clear-cut examples of a crisis in industrialized fishing with the total depletion of the cod stock. We have seen the non-sustainability, and it has happened to people who has been present and who are present here. We have faced it, and we have also felt and shared the sadness from these participants in the crisis.
In 1992, Dan, think about what happened. The fish disappeared, and with the fish gone, our livelihood also disappeared. Family incomes dropped by more than half, and it's not just the people in the fishery who have heard it. In my community alone, when the plant closed down in 1992, more than 50 businesses have closed their doors. Teachers have been laid off, and hundreds of other workers have also lost their jobs. In my area years ago, when work was hard to find, the men left the province to seek employment in other provinces. Today, we got families moving, we got women moving, and most importantly, we got our young people, our younger generation is leaving the province.
We have also seen what has risen from the ashes of this production which has been in Newfoundland, and that is to some extent the same creature has been rising from the ashes. We saw the most fashionable, most modern and efficient shrimp factory I've ever seen. It's even more resource demanding, and it is even more capital intensive, and yet it is providing a few fish workers their daily livelihood.
At the AMTEC Fish crab processing, we process 25,000 pounds per day with over 200 workers for 8 hours. Now today we're processing 90,000 with 150 workers in an 8-hour shift. So yes, the resource has to come in fast for us to gain any benefit from what's coming in. I remember 6 years ago, our boss was going through the plant with this section, and we asked what it was, and he said some markets were looking at having this product sent out as a section as opposed to salad and meat and legs. So we thought nothing of it at the time, but here we are now processing 90,000 as opposed to 25,000, and only last year we saw him going with the full crab, not even sectioned. So probably we're looking at sending the crab just like it is.
Today you're talking about crab, but 8 years ago it happened with the tuna, that you had these massive tuna canneries in Europe which just closed down overnight because Thailand, which didn't catch a single tuna, became the main processor for tuna fish internationally. So overnight, you had huge canneries grow in Thailand, destroying mangroves and everything because they had to create big ports to let these tuna vessels come in. No Thai vessel caught a single tuna at that time. And all the fish, the majority of the tuna of the world was being canned in Thailand, you see? And you had all these canneries in Spain closed down overnight.
Well, as the meeting unfolded, a lot of similarities started to emerge in terms of the kinds of changes that are happening in different countries around the world. A lot of them talked about declining fish landings and their consequences for fish workers in their countries. They talked about increased competition for fish, a focus on exporting fish products. They talked about conflict between tourism operators and the development of tourism and fishing communities. They talked about habitat destruction, technological changes, and new fisheries initiatives, new kinds of management, for example. They pointed out that the changes were having different kinds of impacts on different groups of women and were affecting men and women differently.
To say that also in Para-State, industrial fishery sector is facing a crisis. Men and women employed by the 40 companies in the state of Pará were in 1993 4,800 and now in 1999 2,800. What happened is that unstable job is increasing. Subcontracting of enterprises is also becoming a common practice. And I have some data about occupational trajectory of some women who work in fish processing plants. And we see in their history that it's frequent to change, to leave the job, to come back to the job when, according to fish landings, and also it becomes more and more difficult for them to find a place with documents signed. It means that informality also becomes a feature in the fishery sector of Para-State, and so the women also face the situation in difficult conditions.
Similarities in the changes to fisheries around the world have led to speculation that they are linked to more general changes, such as those associated with globalization. What is globalization, and what does it have to do with the lives and livelihoods of the women and men who depend upon fisheries around the world?
So I think what we generally agreed on was that globalization is not a very new process, it is a much older process. But what is happening now is certainly a very much newer and far more intense. It's coming through in various ways in different countries, but basically it is experienced as a global environment and political order dominated by a few, whether it be the IMF or the World Trade Organization, international trade agreements such as that, powerful governments of the North and South, and of course multinational corporations, transnational corporations, whatever you call them.
Within fisheries, globalization has been linked to spatial shifts in fishing effort. So, for example, vessels moving from Newfoundland down to the coast of Africa would be an example of globalization. It's been linked to increased focus on exports, so the production of fish products for export rather than for local consumption. And related to that, changes in access to fish products within fishing families and by fish vendors and processors. In some areas, globalization appears to be contributing to stock depletion, to habitat destruction, to the development of issues around food security in some of these countries. And I think in particular, one of the things that we're starting to realize is that the impacts of globalization are not necessarily the same for men and women in different countries.
The importance of the gender division of labor in affecting how women and men are impacted by global shifts in production. We do different jobs, so when there are shifts in production, changes in work and jobs, you have to look at what the gender impacts of that are. And also in terms of policy impacts, because of the gender division of labor, we're going to be affected differently than men. The impact on women's unpaid work has been looked at a lot. The severe consequences of restructuring for the unpaid work of women in our households, in our communities, in subsistence production, the increased workload that women face as services are cut, and the increased work due to environmental degradation. And as well, the increased work due to the emotional work that women do when our communities and families are under stress. Another element would be unequal access to resources. Women don't have the same access to resources needed to survive in the global economy. We can look at resources ranging from credit to new technology, to resource access to the fisheries research itself, to policy entitlements in terms of adjustment policies, income security policies. And one important kind of resource is the common resources that women worldwide make use of, and those are certainly threatened. So generally we need to look at where, who, how, and by whom fish are harvested, processed, distributed, and consumed. Who gets the work, who gets the profits, who gets the product, and where are men and women located in this?
Let's look at changes in the production, processing, marketing and consumption of fish and their consequences for women and gender relations in some African countries.
Gambian, for example, women in the fishery sector are not globalized. In terms of trade, women produce only for the local market. So here we look at it, it's men who are globalized in that sense because they produce for the external market and it's their product that goes out. Women product is consumed at the national level. So for that reason, I would say that the Gambian women are marginalized in a sense that, they don't get access to credit. So here I connect credit to globalization because it's another source or means of getting income in order to process and export to the world market.
We talk about how globalization has impacted the fisheries sector in Tanzania. Coming to the marketing point, the local community now, like the domestic market, is much more depending on the juvenile fish. The fish which is not allowed to be fished. And now, it's only now the fish which is available for local community. The big fish is mainly exported to European countries. On the consumption side, we are facing the same problem. How most of the household, being a fishing household or non-fishing household, they are not getting enough fish because most of the fish is exported to outside country.
Nigeria is one of the largest fish markets in West Africa, and we are now moving from being producers to being importers. We now, about 60% of the fish that is consumed is imported as trash fish for local consumption, whereas the shrimps are exported by the trawling companies. But the impact on the women is that women, instead of being looked at as producers, are now looked at as consumers. And therefore, they are marginalized. Because except they are recognized as an active part of the production system, they are not going to be able to be economically viable.
In Zanzibar, we have tourism. Tourism is a new activity, which was maybe initiated in the last 6 to 7 years. And now, with the development of tourism, the price of fish has increased, has gone up. So all the good quality fish, like the marlin, the kingfish, snapers, they go to the tourist hotel. And then the low quality fish, like the anchovies, the sardines, like what you call scrap, or is going to the local population. So they still get fish, but the low quality fish, and the high quality fish is going to the hotel.
Yeah, I have a little example from Cameroon, and that's some years ago, the IMF told the Cameroonian government to save money, and that had big impacts on wages. And the result of that was that a lot of wives to people working in the government, working in the bureaucracy, working in firms, they started to do fish trade in order to survive, in order to help their families. And they did a really good job in doing that. But at the same time, it became a problem because they they had a lot of fish that they carried out from the area, and that meant over-exploitation for some of the species in the area. So the globalization, in many ways, that starts in the heads of the people in the IMF, have really big impacts on the local communities. So what do you think, Modesta?
We have also some positive impact of the globalization in fisheries. For example, improvement of quality standards. But now with this globalization, at least even fishermen, they know how to preserve their fish. They know how to handle their fish from the fishing point up to the processing plants. Not only that, also there's so much development in the fishing community, like facilities now. And then even at least enabling fishers to build some permanent houses, because at least now they are getting enough income comparing to those old days because of the price.
Maybe globalization has assisted in export of some of the products, fishery products, which cannot be utilized in Zanzibar, but which is the market abroad. For example, we export a lot of sea cucumbers to the Far East, which in Zanzibar nobody is eating these products, but they are a delicacy in Far East. As well as we export a lot of octopus, dried octopus, to Omani and also to other parts of East Africa. So these products, which are not demanded within the country, have a market outside.
Well, the examples from some African countries suggest that some women may be gaining from globalization in terms of, for example, gaining access to paid work and their own income, perhaps for the first time, while other women may be losing. An example would be the vendors and processors of fish who used to take the fish from their husbands and salt it or dry it and then market it themselves independently. With globalization, that fish can be sold directly to a fish exporting plant and leave, and so move directly from their husband's hands into the hands of a company, and so those women can lose out.
Globalization has a conflicting impact on women fish workers. On the one hand, it has accelerated their incorporation to the workforce in many countries, increasing the household income. On the other hand, this incorporation has many pitfalls. The overexploitation, that means working long hours, low incomes, health and safety problems such as crab asthma, lumbago tendinitis, and so on. Globalization, together with the depletion of marine resources, the need for cheap labor, new technology that focus more on product quality than good work conditions, has displaced many women from the workforce.
In Central and South America, some women have gained access to new jobs. For example, in Chile, women are working processing aquacultured salmon. That's a new area of employment for women in that area. Women who worked in fisheries tended to work inside of a household enterprise, so they worked with their husbands and with their children, but they wouldn't necessarily have their own income. So for those women who can find work, paid work in the export-oriented sector, exporting products that maybe weren't there before. For example, I don't think salmon was a major product of Chile in the past, but it's become a major product now. For those women, it can mean their own paycheck and a certain amount of economic independence. On the other hand, the jobs tend to be seasonal. The working conditions are not particularly good in terms of their occupational health risks. Their job security is a real issue for these women. So if you take that example from Chile, there are gains for some women, maybe losses for other women, and there are new kinds of problems that can be associated with the work that they gain access to. On the other hand, if you're in a factory environment, then maybe you can form a union. And one of the indications we have of change is that unions in those areas are starting to respond more to the issues and concerns of processing workers and women workers in particular.
O sea, yo creo que en el caso de las trabajadoras de plantas pesqueras, o sea, el impacto de la sobreexplotación de los recursos marinos afecta directamente sus posibilidades de empleo. De hecho, vimos aquí, por ejemplo, en la planta que fuimos a visitar, que después nos enteramos que solamente trabaja determinados meses del año, porque el resto del año no hay camarón. En el caso de Chile pasa lo mismo, pero como allá somos un país subdesarrollados. O sea, si no hay producto, no hay trabajo, por lo tanto no hay salario, por lo tanto no hay posibilidad de sobrevivencia económica. Entonces, eso es una cosa muy importante. Ahora, también por otro lado, independientemente del tipo de empresa, los precios del mercado son fijados internacionalmente. Entonces también hay toda una necesidad de que las empresas, sobre todo las nacionales, porque las transnacionales que están allá son las mismas que fijan los precios afuera, pero las empresas nacionales, que son medianas y pequeñas empresas, que son las que dan la mayor cantidad de puestos de trabajo en las plantas pesqueras, tienen que adecuarse a los precios internacionales que son fijados fuera. Y eso significa que los empleadores de esas plantas tienen que reducir los costos de producción. Y el costo que reducen, el único costo de producción que pueden reducir es el costo de las remuneraciones. Porque no pueden reducir ni costos de mantención de las instalaciones, ni costos de electricidad, ni de agua, ni etcétera, etcétera.
Ante la crisis de las pesquerías en México, lo que se está tratando de hacer es, bueno, vamos a desarrollar el turismo, vamos a desarrollar la acuacultura, pero también en estos aspectos se tiende a privilegiar lo económico, se tiende a ver solamente qué ganancias puede tener, y no las ganancias hacia los pescadores o hacia las comunidades locales. En el caso también de las mujeres, no conozco organizaciones, sobre todo para el caso del sur de México, donde las mujeres tomen la fuerza, porque también hay estructuras que lo impiden, porque piensan que las mujeres no son afectadas por la crisis de las pesquerías, porque no intervienen en el proceso de captura, sino solamente en el procesamiento y en la comercialización. Y si uno se mete más a fondo en los hogares, ve que una de las más golpeadas también son las mujeres, porque desarrollan más estrategias incluso que los hombres para sobrevivir. Todo el peso de la estrategia muchas veces recae en niños y en mujeres.
En Chile yo creo que en todas partes es muy diversa. Así como quizás hay pescadores que no están conscientes del manejo de sus recursos, hay casos concretos en que sí. En la provincia de Valdivia existe la Federación Provincial de Pescadores Artesanales, que agrupa como a 30 sindicatos de pescadores artesanales de la zona. Bueno, y a través de esta confederación también se está introduciendo el tema de género y ve la importancia de la mujer.
With globalization, tourism is expanding and becoming more international. The development of tourism can create new local markets for seafood and some new jobs for women and men displaced from fisheries. However, tourists and tourist operations can also make the lives of fishery people more difficult. What consequences is tourism having for women fish workers along Canada's Atlantic coast?
In the western end of Prince Edward Island, where I live in Mimnegash, tourism is a pro. With the decline in the Irish moss industry, our group, Women in Support of Fishing, opened their own business in 1994. Our business is called the Irish Moss Interpretive Center, Seaweed Pie Cafe, and we also have a gift shop. We provide jobs for 6 people. There's 4 full-time workers and we have 2 summer students. The other small businesses in our community hire extra people in the summer, mostly students, and extra jobs are created there. And with the government putting the expense of the upkeep of the harbors on the fishermen, the fishermen are also looking for ways to tap into the tourist industry. Therefore, the tourism in my community is a plus because it creates jobs and revenue.
I live around the tip from her, and tourism in my area means golf courses and resorts. And we are being squeezed out of, we are even being asked to sign agreements with, we were first there. I was the only house there when I built my house there, and we built it with our own 2 hands, my husband and I. And since then, we have seen a boom in the cottage industry and a boom in tourist operations, golf courses, everywhere. And now they want me, they have asked me to go to every landowner and get a written agreement with them that it's okay that I continue to do what I'm doing. And I've been doing it for 15 years. And my husband's family's been doing it for 40 in the exact same spot. And we go to meetings together, and they say that the reason is safety. Navigable Waters Protection Act, that we have to ensure safe passage for every vehicle, recreational or otherwise, through the waterways. But when we go to meetings as a group, when they bring the watershed groups together and the tourism industry is there, their main concern is, and they have vocalized this, who am I going to sue when the tip of my water ski gets caught on one of your markers? So what am I going to do? Government is bowing to the pressure of tourism, because tourism is making some, difference in some communities. But on the other hand, they're asking me to sacrifice my livelihood so that people can come there for only 2 months out of the year. I live there for 12.
In our area, huge tracts of land have been bought by largely German, but international. So you have these small fishing community. They're on one side of the road, not the water side. Like there's lots for sale for $11,000, and on the other side there's 5-acre lots starting at $160,000. So people in the community can't afford to live along their shorelines and it's not the whole community. Half the community is being taken up like that, like huge pieces of acreage.
Well, aquaculture has been around for centuries. In countries like China, we have a long-standing history of involvement with aquaculture, but it's a different kind of aquaculture from the kind of aquaculture that we see spreading around the world today. It was less intensive in terms of its focus, tended to be multiple species that were involved, often the integration of agricultural and aquacultural kinds of activities, and the focus was the production of food, often for local consumption. What we're looking at now is intensive aquaculture that tends to be corporate controlled. It involves the use of cages or ponds where you have very high density types of production, and that has been associated with the elimination of access to coastal areas for local people. Habitat destruction is a critical issue, particularly in the shrimp aquaculture industry. And there has been major opposition to some types of intensive aquaculture in many countries of the world.
It is the race for the highest revenue and profit. And this race is going on the faster, the less international and national regulations we have on industries, on labor work, on labor and on environmental regulations. So what I call deregulation, that means the liberalization is speeding up the restructuring of the fishing industry globally, and with that, these fast movements of industries. Also, the development of aquaculture, the so-called blue revolution, is fueled by the global fish market, by the desire to produce export products for highly paying markets. It's taking a high toll on the environment. Aquaculture in general is generating little employment as it is capital intensive. It is taking a high toll in the environment also in the introduction of new species and genetic engineering, which can have severe impacts on the local environments where traditional fishing techniques are taking place. Also here we have seen examples of empowerment of women. I want to turn the attention to the example from Chile, which was an aquaculture project where women were empowered through it, this mass aquaculture of growing of seaweeds and mass. Also in the aquaculture there may be a positive spillover on the few. It may be corporations, huge transnational corporations that are going in, opening up tiger prawn growing, but it may also be a local elite. In these areas there will be a changing of the customary use of coastal resources by the introduction of aquaculture. People produce a product that is too expensive for themselves to eat. It is aiming for export.
Well, fisheries management is like agriculture. It's not new. There's been different types of fisheries management developed at the local level. Very many different kinds of fisheries management that have existed around the world. In general, fisheries management refers to mechanisms for limiting access to the fishing resource and also mechanisms for limiting the amount of fish you take, the time you take that fish, the size of fish you take, and issues like bycatch, or whether you're taking 3 or 4 species or just 1 species. So fisheries management is not new, but one of the things that we're seeing with globalization is a shift to new types of fisheries management and the rapid spread of different types of fisheries management around the world. So if we look at fisheries management issues in the last few years in Canada, for example, there have been government-controlled attempts to manage fisheries have been going on really fairly intensively since the 1970s in Canada. And we're still seeing, in some ways, the consequences of those kinds of initiatives for women and men in fishing communities. And I think one of the things about fisheries management systems is they are generally, well, they haven't been designed with any thought to the potential consequences of those management initiatives for women, and the possibility that those consequences might be different for women than they are for men.
I've been really bothered and concerned about what women from Atlantic Canada have been telling us these days, because after the cod collapse of the cod fishery, we know that the communities have been exposed to so much hardship and pressure, and we would imagine that the government would then try to learn from the experiences and restructure the fishery in a way that the communities can be sustained. What do you think, Mary, is happening now that prevents this, a true restructuring and a participation of the communities and a revival of the communities in the fishery?
Well, part of the whole process from the state intervention part has been to eliminate the fishing people, the small-scale fishing people. And that goes way, way back. And they've been stealing licenses, and there's no other way to say it except steal licenses from the people. Because if the fish weren't there, the fish were declining and the catch wasn't good, many fishing people would not go out. They wouldn't use their licenses for a year or two to give the fish a rest.
Yeah.
And then when they went to go back to go fishing, they would have lost their licenses and weren't allowed to go because they said they didn't bank them properly. Another strategy is that's really, really big with our government is to buy back licenses. And I have a real problem with the buyback of licenses for the simple reason, I don't mind that the state will, or government will buy the license back to give the family an income, but that license should go into some kind of a community bank for future generations.
An example of a fisheries management technique that I think is closely linked to globalization is the shift towards a focus on the introduction of quotas within fisheries. Individual quotas or enterprise allocations, i.e. taking the fish resource and dividing it up and allocating a certain portion of that fish resource to individual enterprises or to companies. And that's generally referred to again as IQs, individual quotas or enterprise allocations. One variant of the IQ system is what they call ITQs. And that involves not simply dividing up the resource and allocating quotas to individual enterprises or companies, but giving those people who have quotas the right to buy and sell quota. And the risk that comes with buying and selling quota is the risk of concentration of ownership and the removal of access to fish resources from people in coastal communities. And IQs and particularly ITQ systems are spreading around the world. They started off in countries like Iceland and New Zealand. They now exist in many fisheries in North America. They also have been introduced in Chile, and they are being marketed as the approach to management that would be appropriate for fisheries pretty well anywhere.
Now, in many places, the ITQ is really popular, and it's taking off like in Iceland and parts of the United States and other countries, and in Canada too. It's in some fisheries in Canada, right?
Yeah, right now, all I've heard is just the term ITQs.
Yeah.
But I'm sure if we switch to IQs, ITQs are probably just a short distance down the road.
And that's because of what? Why would you have to move from IQ to ITQ?
Then you'd have transferable quotas, and you'd see companies coming in and probably buying up the quotas. And then I think that would probably erode the community, especially the owner-operators.
Yeah.
You know, then it wouldn't be their fish to catch, because you'd have companies that coming in and enticing them to pass the fish over to them, you know.
Well, how does it work in Iceland?
It's actually what has happened in Iceland, is that big companies have been buying up the quotas. And what has really happened is that the access to the resources being lost from the communities. So, but I see it as part of the globalization, which is one of the topics we are talking about here in this conference, is that there's privatization of access to resources and the industries as well, and the withdrawal of the government. So I think, yeah, that's what you see in Iceland. You see that concentrations, the quotas are being held by fewer companies. And they are also moving from certain areas. So there are villages that no longer have access because they don't have quota.
The rights to fish have gone to different parts of the country?
Yes, ITQ system is based on the idea that fishermen are the actors of the fisheries. But what you see when you look at the communities is that these are fishery communities. They are based on the fisheries, but not everybody's a fisherman. So those who sell quota or lease it out of the community, they leave the other inhabitants without jobs.
Now, some people say, well, what can happen if you create ITQs and you can buy and sell these quotas, is that communities can buy them and hold them on behalf of their communities, or cooperatives or other organizations can do it. But there's another problem, that so can corporations, so can companies.
Yes. And what happened in Iceland is that now we have 10 years of ITQ. It's very hard to turn back. But some people were suggesting in the beginning that they should be based on community, they should be community-based, that they should be linked somehow to the communities. But it's very, very hard to turn back, because it's private property.
Once you get there, there's no coming back.
And that's hardly, it's very hard to
imagine
going back. Well, look at in Iceland, they've had strikes, you've had many court cases, and there's no going back.
Yeah, there was a court case recently, and it was lost.
More and more, as they implement this individual transferable quota system, all the fish is going into the hands of a very few corporate people. It's called paper fish. The owners never have to go out in a boat. They never have to go fishing. They buy, sell, and trade on land. If a fishing family ends up with not enough quota to make it worthwhile to go fishing, they quite often now lease out their fish. And so that captain may get some money for his fish for that year, but that means all the crew members receive nothing. So then what happens to families? There's all kinds of family breakdown, family violence, just so much frustration, because where do we go? What do we do? So we have to figure out ways of making a living and surviving in small communities.
Government and development agencies are supporting the introduction of other approaches to fisheries management in some parts of Atlantic Canada and in countries of the South. One such approach is called Community-Based Coastal Resource Management, or CBCRM.
And basically what community-based management means is the exact opposite of globalization of the economy. Instead of a few people being very rich and the rest of the community suffering, it's fair and equitable distribution of the resource. And it means that you involve various sectors so that the women are involved. The various sectors are all involved in the decision making, but always making sure that the people that are directly involved in the fishery have the primary say in what's going to happen.
In countries like the Philippines and Indonesia, community-based resource management initiatives often try to build on existing traditional management type structures. And that's a good thing. Often those traditional management systems work, and they work well. The difficulty is if women in those areas have had no involvement in those traditional management structures.
with all that, collapsing fisheries and stuff, management is clearly needed. And these traditional institutions are very attractive to the interveners, the NGOs and the academics, because the traditional institution, it's embedded in the local culture. It's highly legitimate. People pay attention to the rules. So it would be nice not to lose that. And they have a quandary. They recognize that women are really important in the fishery. And they recognize that they have no role whatsoever in this traditional management system. You're challenging a patriarchal system here. And that system, when it works well, it works very well. And you really don't want that to erode that system. So how do you incorporate women without making them targets of violence? The NGOs in Indonesia and the academics have come up with a number of strategies. And one of the key ones is working through the church. They feel much more able to speak up and to air their concerns because they're in this safe place and their minister is giving them that permission. The other key thing is that when you have women doing their traditional thing, in their traditional roles, providing food, doing childcare and stuff for NGO meetings and conferences and stuff, pay them. It's very important to recognize these women with money and with approbation of some sort to make them feel valued.
Women's domestic workloads and responsibilities really constrain and limit women's involvement in CBCRM projects. No? Most of the organizing processes and practices and strategies actually exclude them. No? For example, one, the recruitment and selection criteria for those who will be members and leaders. No? Because one is you should have time to attend these meetings. You should have attended some kind of a training and seminar, and you should have to pay some membership dues, especially in cooperatives. And if you're both members, it would be the woman who said, okay, I will not be the member because we only have this limited money.
Poorly designed community-based resource management initiatives can give the appearance of increased democratic decision-making and an increase in the capacity of communities to responsibly manage their fishing resources without actually achieving the reality of greater democracy and greater capacity. If they offload the responsibility for a resource or for a coastal area onto a community, but don't give them the power and the financial and training resources that they need to actually manage those resources, then you can have a facade without a reality. And we did hear about that as a major issue from some of the participants from countries of the South. And in fact, it was suggested at the meeting that CBCRM may be just another example of a management strategy that's being exported from countries of the North to countries of the South.
After so much reflection on CBCRM, it's more of like a model, basically Western model, that is like adapted into the context of, slightly adapted into the context of fishing communities, then implemented the model there.
I find it very strange that you consider it a northern or western concept when we don't even have it here. Yeah. We are funding it overseas, but we don't even have that money to do this kind of work in our countries when it would be.
SIDA is one major player. SIDA, USAID, USAID. So just like transferring, that's the political question. Why is it? Why the money is poured into southern countries, Asia especially. Now it's China.
Given some of the negative consequences globalization appears to be having on fishery communities, gender relations, and some groups of women and men who work in fisheries around the world, are there any alternatives? And how do we get there?
To reverse globalization and produce for local needs that is even going further than a revolution, isn't it? Yeah. But to me it raises the question, how would that look locally if fishing communities had that as a starting point? What will it mean to produce for local needs, to be independent of the global fish market? What we know is that globalization is ruling fishing communities, and one can manage to pull out some of the benefits a few of the benefits from this intensive technological and capital-intensive production. One can also pull out some advancement for women. We don't know yet what we can gain from the reverse thing.
How do we get there? How do we dream to get there? Start from where you are and what you think are issues which will keep this fishery going in the way you want it to go for you and your children. Yeah?
I'd like to see a reversal in the trend towards favoring the more large-scale fisheries with fewer numbers and greater profits. Just see a complete reversal of that trend, to see a redistribution of the wealth, calling licenses and quotas the wealth, and see it come back to larger numbers that will support larger numbers of people and their families in local communities.
A sustainable fishery is a fishery whereby the fisher folk will be able to fish from the ocean year after year or generation after generation to ensure their survival. And in doing so, we have maybe different problems from the north. We have, right now, what is happening is habitat destruction. So in order to ensure sustainable fishery, we need to reduce this habitat destruction. For example, destruction of the mangroves. The mangroves are nursery and breeding grounds of fish, and if the community have management scheme of controlling cutting of the mangroves, then we can ensure the future fish, the fish which will be recruited into the fishery later. So reduction of or management of habitat like mangroves, or coral reef destruction.
Coming from Southeast Asia, I guess, our vision would be a coastal community where no people are hungry. It's basically an issue of survival, an issue of income, of food, and cash security. So how can we do this? One would be the recognition of men and women in the equal access and control of the resources. So designating a preferential use rights to coastal communities. It's a preferential use rights against commercial fishers. And not only in the management, but also in the use and development of these coastal resources. And corollary to that would be making them the major actors in decision-making bodies, not only in rhetorics or in the form of tokenism, but really putting warm bodies inside these structures.
Shall we carry on with the Philippines before we come back? Yeah, the Southeast.
I would like to share the hopes of two shell gatherers in our bay. All of us hope to increase our catches of fish to support our family, said Consolacion. I myself, she said, also aspire that the rights of women be recognized to give us women a chance to prove ourselves equal to men. My friend Lyda is participating in the program for the sake of her children. Lyda said, I have no land. I have no valuable possessions to leave my children. I will leave them the fish. Thanks.
Our concern and our dreams are related with the no more depletion of our resources and more conservation. And that depletion, and to take everyone to assume the responsibility that we have in that depletion of resources, not only the big companies or the big trawlers in the ocean, but also the artisanal fisher. We need to learn how to produce, to conserve, and not to deplete our resources. Because that, if we do that, we are destroying, but the fisher community are destroying their way of lives. Mm-hmm. So that is the relationship between conservation, natural conservation, and cultural permanency in the time. So that is what we want to say.
How do we get to realizing some of these dreams. And unless we dream about how we can get there, we won't do it. We have to do it.
I work in our community. I work with women that's been affected by the fisheries and the downturn in the processing, and I think my dream would be to find a way to reach all these women and bring them out and unite them and empower them, per se, to know that there's something they can do, because women tend to present things better. Women tend to lead the march on things, and I think that our communities would be healthier if the women came back into it. That would be my dream, is to strengthen the women and bring them back in more focused on strengthening their communities.
We brought together researchers from universities, researchers who are working in communities with non-governmental organizations, and Atlantic fish workers. One of the things that we discovered in the course of the meeting was that these groups don't always work easily together. There are issues around language, but there also was a tension in the workshop between the real strong immediate needs for lobbying and for change that was confronting the fish workers who were at the meeting, and the more distant focus on study and research and exploration that tends to be typical of a researcher type of focus. So there was a tension there.
We have two very defined and separate groups of women here. We have researchers and scientists and sociologists on this hand, and we have women who are living in Atlantic Canada and all over the world on this hand who are living what you're studying. And I think that there's a misconception that this sort of living is happening only in Indonesia, or it's happening only in South Africa or North Africa or wherever. It's happening in Woods Harbor, Nova Scotia.
We don't hear what lobbying efforts are going on within the academic community, other than the fact that you do some wonderful research. Where does the research go? You know, is it just going towards a degree, or is it actually reaching some years?
Community work is very depressing because you're trying to work with families, with people who are trying to find a way to make a living, a way to survive. And this is the greatest opportunity that we have here today, or over this week, is to sit together and strategize. How can we work better together? And how can we get those policy alternatives written? We want to leave here with hope. We want to leave here with taking something back to our communities that can move us forward.
The flip side of globalization is that it increases the opportunity and the need for women to network around the world. If we're going to address and confront the issues that globalization is creating for women fish workers, then we have to start networking more effectively. The real issue then is who determines the research agenda, and what are the goals and the outcomes of that research. Research is needed, but who are we researching for, and who are we researching with, and what is the relationship between research and the women and men in fishing communities?
But what we know is that networking and empowerment of women globally is also coming in the wake of these crises which we have identified. We are part of that. It is coming as actual responses. And what I will say is that that empowerment and that networking may reach a critical level, at which level it will actually have an impact that goes beyond what we are talking today. It may have a transforming possibilities of which we have not yet seen the face.
At the end of the meeting, as they prepared to return to the 18 countries from which they came, participants formed a Gender, Globalization and the Fisheries Network and produced a joint statement of the issues, concerns and principles that will underlie their work together in the future.
During the past week, we have been moved by the realities of technology's destructive impacts on fishery resources and ways it's forcing fisher people into bankruptcy. It's also eliminating jobs and livelihoods in both North and South and threatening the health of fish workers. Technology should be designed to produce not only a quality product, but also a safe working environment. We need to stop the encroachment of industrial and other destructive fisheries which deplete marine life. We reject large tourist projects that push people out of traditional fishing grounds and communities. Tourism should complement the small-scale fisheries of coastal communities, leaving gentle ecological footprints on our landscapes. We are concerned with the way our national governments give up to multinational corporations their responsibility to protect citizens' rights and inheritance. These corporations control our resources and economies with insufficient responsibility to protect and conserve them. Our vision of a sustainable fishery is based on coastal communities where resources are cautiously harvested using ocean-friendly technologies. It also promotes an environmentally and socially sustainable processing industry. We seek an industry which promotes local food security rather than the production of luxury delicacies for a global market. The concerns of coastal and rural communities must be central to government policy, fisheries management, and international trade agreements. Socially responsible policy would not abandon the health of our environments and people to unfettered international competition. Women have always played a crucial and active role in fisheries and in sustaining life in their communities. Yet in countries all over the world, they have been largely ignored. Women's political decisions must shape policy, and we need to put warm hearts into decision-making bodies. This conference formed alliances and promoted networking among academics and people living in coastal communities. We have made a commitment to share information and our ideas, making them accessible and useful to everyone, particularly those coastal community peoples who are struggling to survive. We commit to research that is ethical and responsive to the needs of coastal communities. We recognize the work and contribution of Southern researchers, and together we aspire to create equitable South-North collaborative initiatives.
In many, many countries of the world, women have been raising the issues of women who work in the industry and women who live in fishing communities, and the issue of gender relations, and wanting and asking and demanding for a greater say in the management of fisheries resources. There have been a series of international workshops now on gender in fisheries, all of which have begun to address the issues around globalization. So we're part of a series of things. We're working together, and this was just the Canadian piece, in some ways, of an international initiative that's being led by women leaders, basically, around the world.